one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
50 years ago, the United States made history by putting the first man on the moon. We went again, 5 more times, the famed Apollo missions. But since 1972, humans have not been back to the lunar surface and haven't ventured beyond the outer reaches of the Earth's atmosphere. Now NASA is embarking on a new challenge, the Artemis program, with a goal to be on the moon again in 2024 and put new destinations on the map. As it has in the past, the future of human spaceflight travels right through Northeast Ohio. On this special edition of 3 News, we'll show you the next generation of spaceflight. We'll take you inside NASA and introduce you to the people helping us get back to the moon and then go farther than humans have ever traveled before. Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Betsy Kling. Space has always fascinated humankind. From the observations of the ancient Greeks to modern-day telescopes and satellite exploration, we are obsessed with the universe around us. Could we inhabit the uninhabitable? It was just 12 years after the dawn of the space age that Ohioan Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. Now there are people living in orbit, and we are on the verge of a new chapter in space travel. What an incredible journey it has been.
We are going back to the moon. This time we're going to have a sustainable presence at the moon, on the moon, around the moon.
We have main engine start.
Just 50 years ago, the world celebrated as NASA put 2 men on the moon, an historic and unprecedented achievement of science, and now the agency is looking to go farther.
The moon is a waypoint on the way to Mars.
It all starts in 1958 as NASA's predecessor, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, was trying to catch up with early success in space by the Soviet Union. When it opened on October 1st, 1958, NASA began accelerating the work that was already underway with human spaceflight.
I'm sure that Cleveland will benefit from the increase in the space effort.
First up was Project Mercury to see if humans could even survive in space. Then came Project Gemini, testing the capabilities of what NASA needed to do to put man on the moon, before Apollo 11 did just that in 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Despite the groundbreaking success on the moon after Apollo 17, plans and priorities shifted, and humans haven't touched the gray soil since.
And while we all love the history of Apollo and the legacy that it left, it established the United States of America as the preeminent spacefaring nation, and that legacy remains today. It is also true that in 1972, we came home and we never went back.
In the following years, NASA's focus shifted to missions in low Earth orbit, like Skylab, the Apollo-Soyuz test, and eventually the Space Shuttle, which helped to construct the International Space Station. After the completion of the space station, the administration asked for plans that could establish a permanent human presence on the moon, named Constellation. The program started to develop a new crew capsule and lay plans for a return to the moon and eventual exploration of Mars, but it was canceled in 2011. Despite its cancellation, Constellation was not without its benefits. The crew capsule first designed under that program was called Orion, and it's the Orion capsule that will be at the heart of the Artemis missions, taking us back to the moon and eventually Mars. Well, from the Mercury missions through Apollo, when NASA sent a crew into space, they used capsules launched by rocket. You saw all that changed in 1981 when NASA began using the Space Shuttle. But for their next leap forward, NASA is going back to the capsule. And as you can imagine, it's a little different than its predecessor.
So Orion is the spaceship that's going to take people from low Earth orbit, which is a couple hundred miles above the planet, out to deep space to places like the moon or Mars or asteroids or beyond.
The trip back to the moon will also look like a trip back in time, as NASA is going to rely on a familiar past design to take us into the future.
I've heard that it's about 30% bigger inside than the Apollo capsule, so there's a little more room for the astronauts to move around. And of course, with all the new technology, once we get the displays and controls for the astronauts in there, it's not going to be the old switches that we had in the space shuttle. It's going to be, touch screens. It's going to be, a lot of more, digital technology. So that'll be exciting as well.
It's taken scores of people to plan, design, and build every component of the craft. Millions of parts that have to work together perfectly.
So anytime you have something that complex, you always find little issues that you've got to solve, and we find them, you know, it's probably a handful every day we solve.
It's time-consuming and deliberate, creating the next generation of spacecraft from scratch.
It's a very incremental process, so there are several components, such as like your avionics, guidance, navigation, control, certain boxes that get tested at the vendors before they get shipped here and integrated into the vehicle. We do environmental testing here as well, so we do have a thermal chamber that does it at ambient pressure, so just, you know, your normal, you know, everyday pressure here. We do a thermal test, and we are going to be doing an acoustics test on each of the modules, so the crew module separately, the service module separately, and then we'll integrate the two together. After they're integrated together, we go through a whole another round of testing to make sure that the crew module and the service module can talk together, and that all their systems are working correctly.
For those building Orion and the Space Launch System, having a direct connection to the next time people go to the moon is a dream come true.
Have you seen any of your colleagues pushing back retirement dates?
Yes. You know, I've seen a lot of folks. We all want to get to the point of having humans back in space and back to the moon, and I think we're all excited. I know I'll keep pushing until it happens.
The Orion spacecraft is bigger than any other capsule NASA has ever put into space. So how will it be getting there? Well, NASA is borrowing another technology from the past, rockets. But this newest version is more powerful than any rocket launched before. At 322 feet tall and weighing nearly 6 million pounds, the new Space Launch System is made up of several parts. So here's what it's going to look like. Orion and its service module that provides crucial life support and power systems to the crew capsule will be perched on the top. Then comes the core. This contains the huge fuel tanks of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen that will mix together to propel Orion and its crew into orbit. That rocket fuel will feed 4 powerful RS-25 engines. These are the same ones that were used to launch the space shuttle. Now, in order to get enough thrust to get the SLS off the ground, 2 solid rocket boosters will be added, each 17 stories tall and burning 6 tons of propellant every second. It's pretty cool stuff. Well, if you've ever flown into Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, you may have noticed dozens of buildings nearby marked with NASA's iconic logo. That's NASA's Glenn Research Center. But also right here in Northern Ohio are some of the agency's most unique facilities. The Glenn Research Center helped Apollo get to the moon, and propulsion systems being developed there will take these new missions around the moon and beyond. But off the beaten track in Sandusky are one-of-a-kind facilities that makes Northeast Ohio critical to the success of any NASA mission.
The area you see around us today, you saw about a 12 or 13 square mile sections of Ohio farmland taken by the U.S. Army in April of 1941 to make a TNT plant, which 3 days after Pearl Harbor, as it turned out, they were producing their first load of TNT.
The reactor is also an invaluable tool for subjecting materials to radiation conditions.
After the war, the station was idled until NASA took over the facility to build a reactor to assist with the development of nuclear power for its spaceflight missions before it was idled a second time.
And so in 1986, they began to reactivate the station because they wanted to test in this structure these radiators for the International Space Station. And we've been testing ever since.
Tucked deep inside Plum Brook is the Space Environment Complex, a unique facility that sets it apart from any other in NASA.
Behind us is the Space Power Facility part of the Space Environments Complex, which allows us to test in the biggest space chamber in the world, objects in the cold and vacuum of space. It's a real sports car. It can get down from normal Earth pressure, about 14.7 pounds per square inch, down to half a pound per square inch in 2 hours. And then we can get to a so-called hard vacuum in 6 more hours. So in 8 hours, we're able to get from normal Earth pressure to space conditions.
The Space Environments Complex is more than just the vacuum chamber. It also houses a massive shaker table and acoustic chamber, both designed to test articles to their limits before they ever think about flying.
We're road testing it, or we're trying to test it on the ground because it's much cheaper and easier, obviously, to test it on the ground than it is in low Earth orbit or beyond. And so this is a much cheaper and easier way to do that.
Those tests, perhaps one of the most important steps in the testing of Orion, will happen over the course of 2 months. And it's just the beginning of the road back to the moon that runs right through our backyard. Still to come on Orion, the new frontier. We know how the astronauts are getting to space, but how is their ride getting to Ohio for testing? Plus, what happens once it gets here and how it could affect you? That and so much more when we return. Welcome back. NASA is eyeing a moon landing in 2024. And for years, the planning and preparation has been underway at sites around the world. Soon, northern Ohio will be the focus of the mission as the crew capsule called Orion will undergo rigorous testing at NASA's Plum Brook station in Sandusky. Right now, the spacecraft is in Florida, and in order to bring it here, NASA is modifying another exclusive piece of equipment, the C-97 Super Guppy. This is NASA's Super Guppy, a modified airplane that can take large cargo up to 25 feet high around the country. It's flown parts for the Space Shuttle, the International Space Station, and now the Orion spacecraft. Behind the controls is NASA Glenn pilot Mark Russell.
I flew an airplane that had some similarities to this in the Navy, so it was natural to come and support this program. So it's a little dark because they turned the power off.
Okay.
The Guppy is difficult to fly, even for Russell, who has 22 years of experience.
This is humbling. That's how I felt the first time I flew it. The first landing I had, it was like a controlled crash. It felt like that, and I'm like, this is humbling.
This is the last Guppy built, made in the early 1980s. So the technology, it's not quite up to date.
There's no computer flying this thing?
No, we have no autopilot. The closest thing we have to avionics that are upgraded is this box, which is probably good 1990s technology.
To load the Guppy, the entire nose swings open, but that isn't a simple task.
You need to disconnect flight control cables, disconnect electrical wires and things like that in order to open the nose, and then once we load the payload, we close the nose back up and we need to remake all those connections.
Even with its unique design, the Guppy needs to be modified to hold Orion. Supports needed to be reinforced, and that's why NASA ran this fit test before the real spacecraft is loaded.
It's not the size that's the challenge, it's the weight. At 48,000 pounds, it'll be the heaviest cargo the Guppy's carried, and that creates challenges.
You have to do multiple fuel stops because you don't want to load the fuel tanks all the way up on the way just to save weight.
This won't be the Guppy's first flight to Mansfield. In 2015, it brought other Orion parts to be tested at Plum Brook. Russell and the flight engineers have to work together to get the plane back on the ground safely.
This airplane can stop really quickly because of all the drag, so it's not, you don't have to worry about critical length of the field to land. It's a ballet going on with effectively priceless gear in the back.
Russell was told more people have piloted the Space Shuttle than have flown the Super Guppy.
So it's a very small group of people who get to do this. This on my resume is pretty cool.
So once the Super Guppy brings Orion to Mansfield, the capsule still has to get to Sandusky for testing. The move will be slow and carefully planned. It's a 44-mile journey to Plum Brook Station for space environment testing. That's when the road test really begins.
The systems were designed, well, especially the chamber was designed a long time ago, and it was actually designed to handle nuclear radioactive rockets and power systems. So that's why it's kind of the design that it is today, and it never was used for that.
Tucked away among the dozens of buildings at NASA's Plum Brook Station is the Space Environments Complex, home to the biggest vacuum chamber in the world and the site of some of the most important testing of the Orion capsule.
The main purpose of the test is to make sure that the Orion capsule and the service module can live up to how it was designed. So it's basically to shake out Any kind, it's a qualification test, so you're basically proving that it meets its requirements.
We test the most extreme cases of those, right? As much as we can, we try to simulate space within the limits of the facility, right? So obviously in shade and space, it's a little bit colder than what we can do here, but it's pretty close.
But just preparing Orion for the 2-month test is a process in itself.
So we bring it into the high bay, we back it in on the truck, and we lift it off the truck and let the truck go. We put it onto the verticator that I talked about, and then we use a crane and we stand it up, and we pick it up with a crane, and then we sit it onto the cryo floor.
That floor will be the base holding the capsule as it undergoes the rigors of what engineers say is essentially a road test, with every piece of data being recorded by hundreds of sensors.
There's over 1,500 pieces of instrumentation that'll go on this thing.
And you can't test something for spaceflight without simulating the vacuum of space.
So we pump all the air out of this chamber and we hold it like that. It's like 0.80 and PSI. I mean, it's really, really tiny amount of pressure left in the chamber, and we hold it like that for the entire duration of the test.
For those working on the project, the testing and the eventual launch is culmination of years of work and even childhood dreams.
It's so exciting. So I started working on Orion in December of 2007, and I did work on the vehicle side for a while back then. So to finally get to the test where we get to use the stuff that we were planning on back then, it's so exciting. And I can't wait to see this thing launch when it gets back down to the Cape.
It's a real honor to be part of this program. We were told, and I tell the folks that work here, is that this facility is on the path to the moon and Mars. It gives you the chills. It's a great feeling to be able to be part of that program.
So when the testing at Plum Brook is finished, Orion will go back to Mansfield and then fly on the Guppy back to Florida, where it will be attached to the SLS. And when the Artemis program takes to the stars next year, it will be launching from a newly renovated but historic spot at Cape Canaveral. The historic Launch Pad 39B. Apollo 10 was the first mission to lift off from here, followed by over 50 space shuttle missions. But now NASA has a new mission, back to the moon and then on to Mars. Regina Spellman is the senior project manager in charge of making sure everything on the pad is ready to go. We met up with her in the flame trench, where they build a new flame deflector that diverts the rocket's exhaust on liftoff.
Those cladding plates are 4 inches thick, and each one of them can be individually removed. So the exhaust can erode away the steel, and then those plates can be removed as needed after a few launches.
Along the sides of the trench, 96,000 new bricks have been put in place. Fiber optic cable was added, and every system is being tested. Like the suppression system that pumps 400,000 gallons of water through the pad in less than 25 seconds.
Not only is it keeping the structure cool, but it's keeping the sound wave from the exhaust, from the rocket, from bouncing off of the mobile launcher and reflecting back up onto the vehicle and damaging the vehicle.
When the SLS, or Space Launch System, is ready in 2020, a giant crawler will carry it and the launch tower the 4 miles from the vehicle assembly building. So as the crawler rolls up onto Launch Pad 39B, it's been basically retooled to support the most powerful rocket NASA has ever launched. But one thing they didn't change, the original apron bricks in the flame trench. You can see the pitting and how much these things have seen in history.
We've had 2 amazing chapters of human spaceflight from this facility, and we have another one just right on our heels. And it's really exciting to learn from the giants that came before us.
Spellman calls this a once-in-a-lifetime transition between space programs. NASA is putting an emphasis on inclusion in every facet of the project, with the hope of inspiring more women and minorities to pursue their dreams in science, technology, engineering, and math. Still ahead tonight on this special edition of 3 News, NASA is on a mission to go beyond the moon and onto Mars. So how will they make that happen? With a lot of help from the engineers at NASA Glenn. Since we left the moon in 1972, many of NASA's missions found a new destination, labs and space stations held in low Earth orbit. But crews in the Orion capsule will eventually go much farther, to the moon and someday onto Mars. To aid their mission, NASA will build a revolutionary spaceship that will orbit the moon. And it wouldn't be possible without the engineers from NASA's Glenn Space Propulsion Lab. Engineers at Glenn are developing revolutionary electronic propulsion systems that will be used in space to move the Gateway, a mini space station that will orbit the moon, providing support for Artemis.
The Gateway was actually a program that was developed right here at Glenn, and it is now under contract because of the great procurement professionals here at Glenn. One of the things that we need to have on the surface of the moon to take advantage of that water ice is power. Well, right here at Glenn, they've been developing kilopower, so we can take advantage of that water ice, use it for air to breathe, water to drink, and even eventually rocket fuel.
And unlike space stations before it, the Gateway will be equipped to change its orbit around the moon to fit the needs of each mission, and it will utilize revolutionary electronic propulsion engines.
That kind of propulsion is about 10 times more efficient in terms of the fuel that it uses, but it can only be used in space. And lots of folks are used to watching the shuttle take off. Those engines generated a lot of thrust over a short period of time to get into orbit. Electric propulsion, it still provides propulsion for the spacecraft, but it produces a really small amount of thrust.
Electric propulsion is not a new technology, but since these will be a couple 100,000 miles away, maintenance and refueling are major considerations.
This, again, it's about 10 times more efficient in terms of its use of fuel. So for Gateway, that means it doesn't have to carry all that fuel with it to have a 15-year life. Right, we can take a tenth of the fuel and still fulfill all the needs for Gateway.
And if you're thinking these engines will need to make a lot of power to get things moving, not so fast.
Newest technology thruster is a 12.5 kilowatt engine, right? So a hairdryer is about a kilowatt, right? So it doesn't seem like a lot of power, but that's when you put this system together on the spacecraft, we'll run about 40 kilowatts of electric propulsion power. That's 3 times anything that has been flown before on a spacecraft.
NASA's goal is to get the first major part of Gateway, the power and propulsion systems, into space in 2022, and they are targeting 2026 to have Gateway built and fully operational. We'll be right back. The Artemis program is more than just putting people into space. It aims to get humans back to the moon and eventually onto the surface of Mars. The next man and the first woman to ride outside the reaches of the Earth's atmosphere will be traveling on the expertise of scientists who are right here in northern Ohio. Obviously, there is more to come, and we'll be closely following the journey. From all of us at 3 News, I'm Betsy Kling. Thanks for watching, and have a great night.